At 4:17 in the morning on February 9th, 1944, Private Edwin Emeli crouched in a muddy depression beneath a strangler fig on Bougainville's northern ridgeline, watching 43 Japanese soldiers move through the Kenai grass 320 yards down the volcanic slope. He had 6 bamboo darts left in his weathered ammunition pouch, each one carved by his own hands, each one tipped with the concentrated poison of 7-cone snails harvested from the Bismarck Sea. The nearest American machine gun nest lay 800 yards behind him across a ravine his injured ankle would never let him cross, and the forward observation post had been overrun 13 hours earlier. In the next 4 minutes, he would kill 9 enemy soldiers without firing a single bullet, using a weapon system his own platoon sergeant had thrown into a latrine pit 3 weeks prior, triggering a cascade of confusion that would convince an entire Japanese company they were under attack by a battalion-strength force. This is the story of how a half-Filipino farm boy from Mindanao became a ghost in the jungle, proving that the deadliest innovations in war don't come from engineers and laboratories, but from desperate men who remember what their grandfathers taught them about survival. The sound reached Edwin first, not the sound of boots or equipment or whispered commands, but something else entirely. Something nobody else in the 164th Infantry Regiment had learned to hear. It was the absence of sound that gave them away. A pocket of silence moving through the jungle like a hole in reality, where the usual chorus of insects and birds simply stopped, then started again in the wrong order. The Japanese infiltration techniques were legendary, near perfect, ghost-like in their execution. But they had learned their jungle craft in Malaya, in Burma, in the rubber plantations of the Dutch East Indies. They had never learned the volcanic jungles of the Solomon Islands, where the hornbills nested low, and the cicadas went silent only for snakes, not for men. Edwin pressed his body deeper into the mud, his fingers finding the smooth bamboo tube at his side. The blowgun was 3 feet long, hollow, sealed with tree sap at both ends, with a channel bored through the center. His grandfather had called it a sumpit in Tagalog, though the old man had learned the craft from Dayak traders who'd sailed from Borneo before the First War. Most American GIs had never seen one. The few who had thought it was a joke, a toy, something for hunting birds, maybe not for killing Japanese infantry in the middle of the largest offensive the Solomon Islands had ever seen. The battalion intelligence officer had laughed when Edwin first showed it to him back in Brisbane. Captain Morrison had actually patted him on the head like a child with a slingshot. "That's real cute, Private," he'd said, his Boston accent thick with condescension. "But we're fighting an Imperial army, not rabbits in your village." 3 days ago, Captain Morrison had taken a knee mortar shell to his foxhole. They'd shipped what was left of him back to Australia in a poncho. But here, in this moment, in this pocket of hell, where the jungle grew so thick the sun never properly rose, Edwin knew something every military tactician from West Point to Tokyo had somehow forgotten. Ancient weapons became ancient because they worked. They'd survived 10,000 years of human warfare because they solved problems that modern technology often overcame through sheer volume of fire. But when you had no ammunition, no support, no radio, and no hope, when you were alone against an enemy that owned the night, ancient became modern real fast. If you're already hooked by this story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because what happens next is the kind of battlefield innovation they don't teach in any military academy. Drop a comment below and then tell me, have you ever heard of anyone using a blowgun in World War II? Because I guarantee you, after this story, you'll never look at improvised weapons the same way again. Edwin Macaulay wasn't supposed to be in the American Army. Hell, technically, he wasn't even supposed to be in America. He'd been born in a fishing village on the eastern coast of Mindanao in 1923, the son of a Filipino mother and a father whose white American face appeared twice before disappearing into history. His mother had died of dengue fever when he was 7. His grandfather, a leather-faced man named Mateo, who claimed to be 96 years old but was probably closer to 70, had raised him on stories and skills from a world that was already vanishing. The old man had fought the Spanish as a boy, fought the Americans during the Philippine-American War, and then somehow ended up working as a guide for American missionaries in the 1920s. He'd seen more kinds of warfare than most generals, and he'd survived all of it by knowing three things better than any soldier in any army: how to read the jungle, how to move through it without disturbing it, and how to kill silently from a distance that made modern men feel safe. The sumpit had been Mateo's primary hunting weapon, not because he couldn't afford a rifle, though he couldn't, but because a rifle announced your position to everything in a 5-mile radius. A blowgun killed silently. The poison did the rest. In the dense jungles of Mindanao, Mateo could take 3 wild pigs in a morning hunt, and the rest of the herd would never know he was there. He taught Edwin the craft, starting when the boy was 9 years old. By 12, Edwin could hit a coconut at 40 paces. By 15, he could put a dart through the eye of a flying kingfisher. But skill meant nothing without respect, and respect was something Edwin never got. Too short, too thin, too dark, too quiet in the village. The other boys called him Anak Hanjin, child of the wind, because his father had blown in and out like a monsoon. In the provincial capital of Davao, where he'd gone seeking work at 16, the Spanish mestizos who ran the businesses looked at him like he was something stuck to their shoe. When war broke out and the Japanese invaded in 1942, Edwin had tried to join the local Filipino resistance. They'd given him a machete and sent him to dig latrines. He'd made his way to Australia by fishing boat, a nightmare voyage of 23 days that killed half the refugees on board. In Brisbane, desperate for bodies to feed the Pacific meat grinder, the American Army recruitment officer had been slightly drunk and significantly behind on his quota. Edwin had nodded. He'd never touched an M1 Garand in his life. "Congratulations, son. You're now Private Edwin Macaulay, serial number US 329874456. Welcome to Uncle Sam's Infantry." The 164th Infantry Regiment trained in the mountains outside Brisbane, where the Australian summer heat made every man feel like he was being slowly cooked inside his own skin. Edwin failed every physical test in the first week. Too weak for the obstacle course, too slow in the timed runs. His rifle marksmanship was abysmal. He kept closing the wrong eye and flinching at the recoil. During bayonet practice, an Iowa farm boy named Jensen knocked him flat on his back 3 times in 90 seconds. "Jesus Christ, Macaulay." Sergeant Hayes had bellowed, his red face looming over Edwin like an angry moon. "My grandmother could fight better than you, and she's been dead for 8 years. Edwin had wanted to say, "I can read animal tracks in total darkness. I can identify 70 different bird calls and what they mean. I can make poison from cone snails that will drop a water buffalo in 30 seconds. I can put a projectile through a target the size of a silver dollar from 60 feet away without making a sound." But his English wasn't good enough for that conversation. And even if it had been, Hayes wouldn't have cared. The modern American military machine had no place for ancient jungle craft. It wanted men who could fire 8 rounds a minute from an M1, fix bayonets on command, and die in neat, organized rows when the situation called for it. So Edwin kept his mouth shut and took his beatings. He practiced with the Garand until his shoulder was one massive bruise. He ran the obstacle course until his lungs felt like they were full of broken glass. He learned to march, to salute, to respond to orders barked in English so fast he could barely parse the words. And at night, when the other men slept, he would slip into the bush beyond the camp perimeter and practice with a sumpit he'd rebuilt from bamboo stolen from a quartermaster's packing material. The cone snails had been harder to acquire. You couldn't exactly walk into an Australian chemist and ask for conotoxin. But Brisbane had a museum, and the museum had a marine biology section. And the marine biology section had a junior researcher named Michael who was very lonely and very happy to chat with anyone who showed interest in his work. It took Edwin 3 weeks of broken English conversations about reef ecosystems before he casually mentioned the sumpit tradition and asked if any Australian species might have similar properties to the Indo-Pacific varieties. Michael had gotten very excited. "Oh, mate, we've got the textile cone snail here. Conus textile, probably the most venomous snail in the world. One drop of pure venom contains enough conotoxin to kill 10 men. The natives in Papua used to use it for fishing. Paralyzes everything, but you can't just, it's controlled, you know? I couldn't possibly. Edwin had listened carefully. 2 nights later, 3 live textile cone snails vanished from the museum's research collection. Michael never reported the theft. Edwin suspected the man knew exactly who'd taken them, but loneliness made people overlook things. Processing the venom was an art Mateo had taught him using fire, evaporation, and enormous patience. The bamboo darts, each one 8 inches long, fletched with paper instead of feathers, weighted with a drop of tree sap at the tip, required even more care. Too heavy, and they'd drop after 20 feet. Too light, and they'd tumble in flight. Edwin tested dozens of prototypes in the bush, adjusting each one by tiny increments until he could reliably hit a target at 75 feet. The poison coating was the final step. Each dart dipped and dried 3 times to build up a lethal concentration. He kept the sumpit hidden in his foot locker, wrapped in an old shirt beneath 3 copies of Life magazine and a letter from a cousin in Manila he'd never actually met. When his bunkmates saw him working on the bamboo, whittling and shaping by lamplight, they assumed he was making some kind of primitive flute. Jensen had asked one night, not unkindly. The farm boy had softened a bit toward Edwin after seeing him take his beatings without complaint. Music, Edwin had said simply. It wasn't entirely a lie. Death had its own music, if you knew how to listen. The 164th Infantry shipped out to the Solomon Islands in December of 1943, part of the massive Allied push to isolate the Japanese stronghold at Rebel. Bougainville was a nightmare assignment. An island of active volcanoes, impenetrable jungle, and some of the most fanatical Japanese defenders in the Pacific. The fighting had started in November, and by the time Edwin's regiment arrived to reinforce the northern perimeter, the casualty rate was running at 40%. Nothing in training had prepared them for the reality. The jungle wasn't just dense. It was actively hostile. Wait a while vines covered in thorns that tore through uniforms and skin. Leeches the size of fingers that dropped from trees. Centipedes whose bite caused necrosis. Mosquitoes that carried malaria, dengue, and a dozen other tropical diseases. And everywhere the smell of rot. Rotting vegetation, rotting corpses, rotting hope. The Japanese owned the night. That became clear within 72 hours. American forces would dig in at dusk, set up perimeter defenses, post sentries, and then wait in terror as the darkness filled with sounds. Sometimes it was obvious infiltration attempts, whistles, taunts in broken English, the rattle of equipment. Sometimes it was just presence. Men would swear they saw movement. Sentries would open fire at shadows. Grenades would arc into foxholes from positions that hadn't existed 10 seconds earlier. By dawn, the perimeter would have contracted by 100 yards, littered with American dead who'd been killed in their sleep or dragged away, screaming into the jungle. "They're like ghosts," Jensen whispered one night, his hand shaking as he tried to light a cigarette in their shared foxhole. Edwin didn't answer, but he was thinking. The Japanese were not ghosts. They were just better at the jungle than the Americans were. They understood that darkness wasn't the absence of light. It was a different kind of visibility. They knew how to use sound, how to move between the American acoustic tripwires, how to become part of the jungle instead of moving through it. It was impressive, professional, deadly. But they weren't perfect. Edwin had noticed something in the last week, a pattern nobody else seemed to see. The Japanese infiltrators moved too well. They were so disciplined, so controlled that they created dead zones in the ambient jungle noise. When a 40-man American patrol moved through the bush, they sounded like a 40-man patrol, talking, coughing, equipment rattling, breaking branches. When a 10-man Japanese infiltration team moved through the same terrain, they sounded like nothing. Complete silence. And that silence moved. It had a shape. If you knew what the jungle was supposed to sound like at night, what the correct pattern of frog calls and insect noises and settling leaves should be, you could hear the hole where the Japanese passed through. Edwin tried to explain this to Lieutenant Barlow, the platoon leader who'd replaced Captain Morrison. Barlow was 23, fresh from officer training, and absolutely terrified of looking weak in front of his men. "Private Macaulay," Barlow said, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension officers reserve for enlisted men they consider stupid. "I appreciate your enthusiasm, but we have trained observers. We have sound detection equipment. We have—" "They move wrong," Edwin interrupted, his English fracturing under the stress of trying to explain something complex. "The jungle, it talks. They make it quiet. Too quiet, like a hole in the sound. I can't hear." "That's enough, Private. We'll rely on established military doctrine, not voodoo jungle magic." Edwin had saluted and left, knowing that established military doctrine was currently getting Americans killed at a rate of 12 to 15 per night. But you couldn't argue with officers. You just had to wait for them to die and hope their replacement was smarter. It was Sergeant Hayes who found the sumpit. Edwin had been using it on solo patrols, unofficial, unauthorized excursions into no man's land during the dead hours between midnight and dawn. He'd killed 7 Japanese soldiers over 2 weeks. Each one had been found at first light, sitting upright in their fighting position, eyes still open. A bamboo dart protruded from their neck or temple. No sound, no alert, just dead men in place, as if they'd fallen asleep and forgotten to wake up. The Japanese had started to get nervous. Edwin could hear it in their night movements, hesitation, tighter formations, more frequent whistle signals to check on each other. They knew something was hunting them, but they didn't understand what. An American sniper would have been predictable, muzzle flash and report. This was something else, something that killed from the darkness without announcing itself. But Hayes had been doing a surprise inspection of Foot Lockers, looking for contraband booze or Japanese souvenirs taken against orders. He'd found Edwin's kit, the sumpit, the darts, the small vial of concentrated venom, the cleaning supplies. He'd held up the blowgun like it was a dead snake. The whole platoon had gathered to watch. Edwin had stood at attention, saying nothing, while Hayes examined the weapon with increasing disbelief. "Are you serious? Are you seriously carrying around a goddamn blowgun? What you, Peter Pan?" The laughter had been immediate and merciless. Jensen was doubled over. Even Corporal Williams, who usually stayed neutral, was grinning. Someone started humming what Edwin later learned was a song from something called Peter Pan, though he'd never heard of it. "This is the stupidest thing I've ever seen," Hayes continued, his voice rising to parade ground volume. "And I once watched a private try to dry his socks by tying them to a mortar round. At least that was creative stupidity. This is just, what even is this? Your grandmother's hunting gear? A weapon from a Stone Age? News flash, Macaulay, the Japanese have rifles. They have grenades. They have artillery." Hayes had thrown the sumpit on the ground and stomped on it. The bamboo cracked, but didn't break. Edwin had chosen the pieces well, but the sergeant had made his point. He'd kicked the whole kit into a latrine pit and ordered Edwin to report for punishment detail. 12-hour shifts filling sandbags in the rear area, far from the front lines, where his Stone Age couldn't get anyone killed. That had been 3 weeks ago. Edwin had retrieved the sumpit the same night, cleaned it, repaired the minor crack with fresh sap, and hidden it more carefully. He'd continued his unauthorized patrols. The body count had risen to 14 confirmed kills, though no one connected them to the quiet Filipino private who got assigned the worst duty shifts and never complained. But the mockery had hurt worse than any training injury. Not because he cared what Hayes thought, but because he could see good men dying every night from Japanese infiltration attacks. And he had a solution, and no one would listen. Pride was a luxury. Survival wasn't. Yet the American military culture demanded conformity over effectiveness, doctrine over innovation. It was maddening. On February 6, 1944, the Japanese launched their largest counteroffensive yet. Intelligence had missed it completely. Missed the fact that General Hyakutake had pulled together over 15,000 troops for a coordinated attack designed to throw the Americans off Bougainville entirely. The assault hit the American perimeter at dawn across a 12-mile front, with the main thrust targeting the northern ridgeline where Edwin's regiment was dug in. The first wave came with artillery. Not the usual harassing fire, but a genuine barrage that sounded like the entire island was being torn apart. Edwin had been in a dugout that collapsed halfway, pinning his left leg under a log beam. By the time Jensen and two others pulled him free, the Japanese infantry was already overrunning the forward positions. He'd been evacuated to the rear, his ankle badly sprained but not broken, while the fighting raged on. For 3 days, the battle seesawed back and forth. The Americans would lose ground during the night, counterattack at dawn, retake some positions, then lose them again when the sun set. Casualties mounted into the hundreds. The field hospital, where Edwin was stationed, filled up, then overflowed. Men died waiting for treatment. Others died during treatment. The ones who survived the doctors often died of infection 2 days later. On the 4th day, the Japanese nearly broke through. An entire company, roughly 200 men, had infiltrated behind American lines during the night using a ravine network the maps said didn't exist. By the time anyone realized what had happened, Japanese forces held the ridge that overlooked the entire American position. If they brought up artillery observers and mortars, they could call fire down on the field hospital, the ammunition dumps, the command post, everything. Lieutenant Barlow had taken the remnants of the platoon, 18 men out of the original 46, and tried to retake the ridge. They'd been cut to pieces in under 30 minutes. Barlow had died calling for his mother. The ravine was neither. It was uncomfortable, difficult, and required moving through 3 feet of mud and stagnant water that stank of rot and chemicals. Perfect. Edwin spent 40 minutes covering 300 yards, not because he was slow, but because he stopped every 10 feet to listen. The acoustic picture of the ridge was building in his mind like a map. There, a cough. Japanese male. Probably a smoker, based on a rasp. 60 yards upslope. Northwest. There, equipment rattle. Metal on metal. Maybe a rifle being shifted. 80 yards due north. There, whispered conversation. Too quiet to make out words, but the cadence was wrong for American English. 100 yards northeast. Probably the machine gun position that covered the southern approach. The cone snail venom worked through a combination of neurotoxins that shut down nerve impulses. Hit a man in the neck or torso, and the paralysis would spread from the injection site within 20 to 30 seconds. First the limbs would go numb, then respiration would fail, then cardiac arrest. Death came in under 2 minutes, and it was completely silent. No scream, no thrashing, just a gradual collapse that looked like someone falling asleep, sitting up. Edwin found the first sentry at 4:06 in the morning. A Japanese soldier, maybe 19, sitting with his back against a tree, smoking a cigarette despite orders that probably said otherwise. The orange glow was a beacon in the darkness. Edwin approached from downwind, moving 6 inches at a time, taking 3 full minutes to cover the last 20 feet. The sentry was focused on the valley below, watching for an American attack that wasn't coming. He never looked behind him. Edwin assembled the sumpit in stages. Slide the dart into the hollow tube. Poison tip forward. Bring the weapon to his lips. Aim by instinct. The sights on a blowgun were useless in darkness anyway. Wait for the sentry to take another drag on his cigarette. Wait for him to exhale. Wait for that split second when his body was most relaxed. Then blow. The dart crossed 22 feet and took the sentry in the side of the neck just above the collarbone. The man jerked slightly, reached up to slap at what he thought was an insect, found the dart instead. He pulled it out, looked at it, confused in the dim glow of his cigarette. Then his arm dropped. The cigarette fell from his lips. His head slumped forward. Edwin waited 5 full minutes, watching for any reaction, any alarm. Nothing. The jungle sounds continued unchanged. He moved forward, checked the sentry's pulse, dead as expected, and took the man's position to survey the next stage. The machine gun position was the priority target. It was set up behind a fallen log with a good field of fire covering the southern slope. 2 gunners, plus an ammunition bearer, who was currently asleep. Edwin could see them from 40 yards out, silhouettes against the slightly lighter sky to the east. Dawn was coming in about an hour. He needed to work faster. He circled wide. approaching from their flank where the fallen log would block their view of him. The sleeping ammunition bearer was closest. Edwin put a dart through the man's temple from 15 feet away, an absurdly easy shot by his standards. The man twitched once and went still. Neither gunner noticed. They were focused on their sector, professional and disciplined. The second gunner was sighting down the barrel of the Type 92 heavy machine gun, making minor adjustments to its position. Edwin waited until the man stepped back, satisfied with his work, and turned to wake the ammunition bearer for a shift change. The dart took him in the throat. He made a small choking sound, staggered, and fell against the log. The first gunner finally turned around. Tanaka, what? Edwin's last dart hit him in the chest, right over the heart. The man looked down at the protruding bamboo, like it was the most confusing thing he'd ever seen. Then he sat down heavily, blinked twice, and died. 3 dead. 3 darts left. At least 40 more Japanese soldiers on this ridge. Most of them starting to wake up. Dawn approached. 4:27 in the morning. Still dark, but the eastern sky was beginning to gray. He had maybe 30 minutes of real darkness left. Time to get creative.